Good evening and welcome to Peachtree Christian Church on this wonderful fall evening. We're so happy to have you viewing with us on live stream or on demand. It's good to be with you. Peachtree Christian Church calls itself a cathedral for Atlanta, and by that we mean we want to be a center for culture, a place where people can meet for education, for theology, for the arts, and in all that, develop community and communion with God and with one another. Tonight, we are going to talk about stories. It's my belief and the belief of many Christian theologians that Christians ought to be some of the very best storytellers. We hold people's stories, we tell people's stories because of the value that these stories have in them and the value of the lives that they expose and remind us of. Tonight, we're going to hear from somebody special when it comes to thinking about stories and the people that we love and care for. Tonight we have gathered together in partnership with the Candler Foundry, which is an initiative from Candler School of Theology to enhance theology and its relationship to the church and to public life. We hope that you enjoy this opening lecture, and we hope that you enjoy what's to come from our visiting scholar, Dr. Scheib. Now I will turn it over to our Senior Associate Minister, Reverend Dr. Jared Wortman. God bless you.
Well, it is my privilege this evening to introduce the Reverend Dr. Karen D. Scheib, who taught practical and pastoral theology at Candler School of Theology from 1998 until her recent retirement in 2020. She served as director of the school's Women Theology and Ministry program for many years, and Dr. Scheib's research interests include faith and health, theological and cultural dimensions of crisis and trauma, and narrative theory and therapy. She is the author of Challenging Invisibility, Practices of Care with Older Women, Chalice Press, 2004, Pastoral Care, Telling the Stories of Our Lives, Abingdon Press, 2016, and Attend to Stories, How to Flourish in Ministry, Wesley's Foundry Books, 2018. In addition, Dr. Scheib has contributed to several other books and written for numerous scholarly and popular publications. Her current writing explores the intersection of ecclesiology and practices of care. She served on the editorial board for the Journal of Pastoral Theology from 2003 to 2005 and is the managing editor from 2005 to 2008. On a personal note, I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Scheib both in the classroom and as my doctoral advisor. It was a few years ago now that I had to list what faculty member at Candler that I most wanted to work with. Dr. Scheib was at the very top of my list, and it was a genuine privilege to learn and receive constructive feedback from her. What you'll hear tonight are words from someone who cares deeply about how we care for one another. It seems fitting that in addition to giving another lecture in Atlanta this week, Dr. Scheib also attended the ordination service of one of her former students. I've come to know Dr. Scheib not only as a professor who possesses a sharp and creative academic mind, but also as a pastor and mentor who genuinely cares for his students and the church. And so, from the comfort of our homes, offices, or wherever you have Wi-Fi, we officially welcome Dr. Scheib as the visiting scholar this fall at Peachtree Christian Church. Let us listen now to her lecture titled, Becoming Story Companions, The Power to Story Care. Thank you.
Thank you for those kind words of introduction, and I will add my welcome to those of you who are tuning in this evening, and I look forward to being in conversation with you. I imagine in the past week, it's very likely that you told someone a story about yourself or your life. Maybe you shared your grandmother's pumpkin pie recipe, or admitted to backing into your garage door. That would be me. Or talked about volunteering as a poll worker. Perhaps you only intended to share information or a funny anecdote, but through telling a short story, you revealed something about who you are as a person, what you believe, how you see the world, and what matters to you. Scholars from a range of disciplines assert that human beings are storytellers, whether drawn on cave walls, recited around a fire, performed, or shared at the dinner table, stories are an essential part of our everyday lives and of human history. As we go through any day, we take in an enormous amount of information through our five senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and even taste. As we take in all this information, our minds chatter away, cataloging what we see and hear, storing memories, and creating stories. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio asserts that storytelling is something the brain does naturally and implicitly. We don't experience our lives as just a collection of naked facts or raw events, but rather as stories. Now, we often think of stories as in terms of the content. What's the story about? But neuroscientists think of story as a mental structure, a way our minds sort through and make sense of the vast barrage of sensory perceptions, emotions, and thoughts accompanying our everyday experiences. Storytelling is the brain's solution to managing all the sensory data we take in any given day and determining what is important to notice and what we can ignore. We also create stories about ourselves as well as the world we live in. Narrative psychologist Dan McAdams says it well: "If you want to know me, then you must know my story, for my story defines who I am. And if I want to know myself to gain insight into the meaning of my own life, then I too must come to know my own story." Life is not only like a story. On some basic level, it is a story, a life story. Now, if we were all in this room together and in a smallish group, I'd ask you and a neighbor to tell a brief story about yourself to each other. Maybe it would be some iconic story your family told about the time you went shimmying up a tall tree to investigate a bird nest and couldn't get your 6-year-old self back down. Maybe you'd recall the summer spent on your grandparents' farm, or a college semester in Spain, or a family reunion. I'd then ask you to introduce one another to the group, not telling the story, but what you'd learned from the story. The responses might be something like this: "Sam's very curious and still likes to climb, but now it's mountains. Alice learned responsibility at an early age by caring for animals on her grandparents' farm. Jordan is adventurous and likes to travel and discover new things. Family is very important to Susan." The rest of us might not know the facts of the story, but we know something about your character, who you are as a person as revealed through story. Participants in this exercise are often surprised how much the other person learns about them through a simple story. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, all of this is very interesting, but so what? Well, if we do accept that stories are a primary means of communicating who we are, then stories matter. Paying reverent attention to the stories we are is a means of caring for one another. What I call story care offers a particular way of caring for each other by attending to our life stories. Story care draws on both theology and narrative psychology. The theological assumption informing my approach is the centrality of divine love, which is a source of human flourishing and well-being. When we dwell in love, we flourish. Narrative psychology helps us understand how life stories shape our development and our identity. Some of the life stories we live by foster our flourishing, while others may leave us languishing. Through the practice of story care, we challenge those stories which leave us floundering and strengthen the stories which foster personal and spiritual growth toward the flourishing God promises. To enter into another's life story is to enter a holy space. The practice of story care invites us into this holy space as story companions, listening to one another as life unfolds, listening for the presence of God. The English word companion derives from the Latin com panus, which literally means bread mates. This image has particular resonance for those of us in the Christian tradition in the practice of communion or the Lord's Supper. Story companions share a substance that sustains our lives and souls. The stories we have been, the stories we are, and the stories we hope to become. But our life is not a singular story, but a collection of interwoven stories. And when Christian is part of our identity, we claim the larger story of this Christian tradition as part of our own. In the context of Christian community, story companions pay a particular attention to the unfolding of God's story in an individual life story. By careful and reverent attention to each other's stories, we accompany one another towards the flourishing God intends. Though I initially developed story care in a book titled Pastoral Care, Telling the Stories of Our Lives, to teach pastoral care to seminary students, I do believe that informed lay givers can also utilize this approach in church communities to care for one another. While some training is helpful, story care is primarily a way of being with and listening to each other, rather than a set of skills. My intention in this lecture and the course that follows is to introduce you to the principles and practices of story care. As we seek to become story companions to one another, it's helpful to know something about how life stories develop. They evolve over our lifetime, beginning in childhood. When we are little, we absorb the stories of our family and the myriad stories we read and hear and see in school, in church, and in our community, and in the larger culture around us. We draw on this library of stories in crafting our own life story. By the time we are adolescents, we are actively involved in constructing our identity and challenging some of the stories about ourselves in the world we have simply accepted to that point. But the process of life story construction does not end when we become adults, but rather remains an important psychological task throughout our adult years. As I have moved into retirement, I'm reminded that this unfolding life story is an ongoing process. Our life stories are not entirely our own invention, but a result of the exposure of the web of stories told by family and institutions and the communities of which we are a part, including our religious communities, all of which are situated in a larger culture. And as we get older, we are exposed to a wider array of stories. And if you've had an opportunity to move from one part of the country to another, you'll notice that different kinds of stories are told in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world. William Randall calls these story webs narrative environments, and we participate in more than one. Narrative environments include the actual collection of written and oral stories we encounter through movies, novels, social media, TV, news, rumors, and any number of conversations in a given day. Narrative environments also include any of the several contexts in which we talk about our lives: family, church, school, work, and community. As I'm settling in Savannah, I'm in a new narrative environment, learning new stories. Now we have another set of new environments: Zoom rooms, Google Hangouts, and FaceTime. These may be significant new and virtual narrative environments for many of us. And these narrative environments, also set the rules for conversation, shaping how we tell stories, whose stories are considered appropriate, who is believed, which stories are considered reliable or authoritative. If you have spent much time in Zoom rooms, you'll notice certain unspoken rules or etiquette about Zoom conversations. You might not say something in a Zoom room you'd say in person, especially if you know it's being recorded. While this metaphor, life as a story, makes sense at some levels, it can be hard to see our life as a story when we're in the middle of living it. When we are in the midst of a story, it feels as if it's simply happening to us rather than we are somehow authoring it. But one way to understand the dislocation many of us feel as a result of COVID pandemic is through the lens of an interrupted story. It's as if we've been reading a novel only to find someone has ripped out the last 3 chapters and we have no idea what's happening next or how the story ends. One day we were going to the office, taking kids to school, meeting friends for lunch, working out at the YMCA, or going to church. Then suddenly everything changed. that story of our lives changed. I was aware of reports of COVID in Washington State in February. By March 8, when I attended a friend's funeral, we bumped elbows rather than shake hands. By March 16th, I was teaching my classes on Zoom. The story changed rapidly. We all have our own personal version of COVID's impact on our life stories, some more severe than others. But it is these interruptions and the attendant feeling of anxiety and uncertainty that actually reveal the storied nature of our lives. For the interruption is not only in our present, but shapes the way we view the past and look forward to the future. Few of us have lived through something that has shaken our personal, familial, communal, national, and global stories in the way COVID has. Whoever imagined church services would be suspended or would be online, that wearing face masks would become routine, or we'd be afraid to visit our children or grandchildren? As we move through the events of our lives and experience, we shape them into stories. We story our lives into recognizable episodes and assign meaning to these stories. COVID, which we can think of as a novel narrative environment, has required us to form new stories of the present and has left the stories of our future uncertain. Disruptions in our story can also lead us to re-story our lives. Restoring is a process of reconsidering, reinterpreting, and revising the stories we hold of who we are, what matters, and where we are headed. Once going to the office may have been dreaded, but now we miss that environment and the people we saw daily. Both storying and restoring occur naturally throughout our lives. Much of the time, however, we're not fully aware of either process. But when something unexpected happens and the story we are living suddenly changes, as with COVID, we may be pushed into restorying. COVID has also challenged the story of what it means to be church. We cannot gather in the ways we used to. We are inventing new ways of being community in virtual spaces. But I believe our interrupted stories offer us the opportunity to become more intentional story companions to one another, as we are all revising our life stories under changing and challenging circumstances. We may also have to figure out how to accompany each other virtually for a while. If we become story companions to each other, we have the opportunity to glimpse into another's heart and soul and assist in seeing God's unfolding story in the life of another. We have the opportunity to accompany each other as we seek the flourishing God intends, even in the midst of difficulty. This is an act of love, enabled by a greater love that holds us. So how do we go about becoming story companions, and what are the practices of story care? Well, the first step is to understand our role and the nature of companionship we offer. Accompanying one another in the exploration of a life story is a collaborative process. I can never be an expert on another's life story. And since one of the goals of story companionship is to connect an individual story with God's story, we need to know something of the biblical story and the story of the church's history. Story care is a practice of the church and reclaims pastoral care as a responsibility of the whole church, not only those who are ordained. Becoming story companions is consistent with Paul's command to bear one another's burdens, Galatians 6:2. As story companions, we join one another in making sense of life events and come to new understandings of an old story. Because we are companions, it's the storyteller's understanding that finally matters, not our interpretation. But through careful, empathic, and reverent listening, we allow the storyteller the opportunity to craft a richer and more complex life story. Listening is, of course, the primary mode of providing story companionship. And story care is not therapy, though it may be healing, nor is it about giving advice or solving another's problem. And while a significant degree of mutuality exists between story companions, it's different than friendship. And when we take on the role of story companions, our focus is on the other's story. When I need to sort out my own story, I seek out my own story companion. Certain ethical responsibilities are expected of story companions, including confidentiality, acknowledging the limits of our care, and seeking supervision in the church context from the pastoral staff, and referring when more help is needed than we can provide. As story companion, we join the storyteller's exploration of their life story in the context of God's unfolding story. This does not mean we need to be heavy-handed in using religious language. If we believe that our stories are held in God's larger stories, we will find glimpses of the holy revealed in the ordinary. Though listening is the primary mode of our story companionship, the metaphor of reading life stories is a helpful one. Just as we can become better readers of literature, we can become better readers of life stories through close reading. If any of you have a background in literature or philosophy, you will be familiar with the concept of close reading. If you have been in a Bible study class, you have engaged in a close reading of a biblical text. In church circles, we often refer to close reading of a biblical text as exegesis, big word that really means something simple. And we may assume that exegesis is something only biblical experts or preachers do. But the term means to relate in detail or expound. It is simply a form of close reading. We engage in exegesis any time we seek to interpret or explain any form of communication, oral or written, including that confusing or enigmatic email from a colleague. We can draw on the practice of biblical exegesis for a close reading of life stories. Of course, reading a written text is a bit different than reading a life story, which is revealed in a living person and is disclosed through conversation, where a text seems more fixed. But in both cases, we seek to gain a deeper understanding of the story in order to consider alternate interpretations. Just as it's possible to read the prodigal son story in several ways, so too is it possible to find various interpretations of a life story, all while holding to the integrity of a text, whether written or lived. The goal of life story exegesis is not only to develop a deeper understanding of the story, but to come to new interpretations of it. A sermon provides an interpretation of the text based on close reading and seeks to connect God's story revealed in the text with the hearer's story. In story care, life story exegesis serves the purpose of revising, reinterpreting, and restoring portions of our life story that are troublesome, problematic, or lead to languishing in order to promote God's intended flourishing. When I was a young child, I was hospitalized several times, and that was in a time when parents were only allowed in the hospital very occasionally. I didn't understand why my parents couldn't visit when I was 6 or 7 or 10, and I often felt I had simply been left alone. Only as I became an adult could I understand my parents' perspective, see my story from their view, and understand their care for me and their worry for me, and that their experience, being able to read into their stories, helped me understand mine in a new way. What follows now is a very quick overview of some of the steps in life story exegesis in the service of story care. I will go into more detail of each of these dimensions in the coming weeks. And while I'm describing this process as if it's linear, it's often a circular process. The first step in a close reading of a life story is getting the story in view. This means being clear of the story that's most important to the teller. Occasionally, a storyteller is quite clear about which story he or she or they want to focus on, which story doesn't make sense, which story needs revision. This is not always the case. In any conversation, any number of smaller stories might be shared. I might be sorting out what is most important to me as I talk to another. At other times, a storyteller might be waiting to see if I'm really listening before sharing a story that's troublesome. In the practice of story care, we listen to the story as a whole. In ordinary conversation, we often listen for facts or information. But a story itself communicates something, as we saw in the opening illustration about telling little stories of our lives, more than just facts. We also assume in story care that the person we are listening to is capable of solving his or her problems, their problems, and needs simply clarity on the situation, not a solution we provide. If we get the sense that a person needs more help than we can provide, we refer, but we continue to provide supportive care and companionship. One of the most important things in story care is our attitude in listening. We listen with open minds. We're curious, as if we're reading a story, as if we're reading a novel and waiting for the next thing to happen, the next part of the story to unfold. We listen with respect, with optimism, and with a hopeful attitude, and with an ear for those places in which God's story is revealed as well. The second step in reading a life story is to pay attention or listen for the backstory. Now, the backstory is a literary term referring to the events leading up to a story now being told. It might include the background and context for the story, but it also shapes the way the story is told. So knowing something about the backstory helps us understand how the storyteller got to this point right now. In fiction, the backstory unfolds gradually. A well-written novel or memoir starts in the middle of the story, and the backstory is gradually revealed. An example of this is the opening line of Jeanette Winterson's memoir, Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal? Her opening line reads, "When my mother was angry with me, which was often, she said, 'The devil led us to the wrong crib.'" That's a very provocative opening line, and we assume there's a story behind it. We don't yet know why the author begins her story this way or what it means to her. We only learn this as the story unfolds. If this were a line shared in conversation, we might be tempted to ask a lot of questions. What do you mean, the devil led you to the wrong crib? We might get more information this way, but as a listener, we would then take control from the storyteller in shaping how the tale is told. So in story care, like in novels, it's best to let the backstory emerge gradually, just as it does in literature. We can have some questions in mind to help us look for clues, such as, what happened to get the person to the particular story being told? How do personal and family history influence the shape of the story? How does the context or narrative environment shape the backstory? Because narrative environments are so important for the formation of our stories, analyzing the impact of these is the third step and distinct step in reading a life story. Remember, the narrative environments include the physical, social, emotional, and historical context of our lives, including family, community, church, geographic location, and culture, as well as a large web of stories. The narrative environments shaping our stories are different for each of us, and our generation and age make a difference. For example, I'm in my 60s, and the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the women's movement, and the events of the 1960s and 70s were a significant part of my narrative environment as a teenager and young adult when I was actively forming my story of identity. For many of my younger students, the events of 9/11 and the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York are marker events of their narrative environments. I suspect COVID-19 will significantly shape the narratives of current teenagers and young adults. The next step in story care is to identify and name what I call problem stories. In some cases, this might be the very first step if the story we are being told is about a specific problem. If that is the case, we gather the backstory and analyze the narrative environments as the problem story unfolds. Maybe I'm facing a difficult situation at work and I need help resolving that. Maybe I'm experiencing anxiety because of the uncertainty of the times we're in. But I place this step here because not all stories are problematic. And again, I envision story care as a way to help sort of ordinary people deal with the ordinary challenges of life. We all can use help from time to time in figuring out where we're going. Restoring, then, is a normal process of development, and the storyteller might just want a different angle of vision on a familiar story. For example, I don't consider my story being called a ministry, a problem story in any way, but as I've retold it over the years, It has thickened and become more complex. And this often happens as we age and we restory our lives in that way. We see details and interpretations we didn't before. Storytelling is also a dialogical process. We tell a story to someone. Even if we're writing in our journal, we are externalizing the story by writing it down, and we might see it in a different way. So as we share it with a new listener, we get a different perspective, and we might tell the story differently to one person than another. And each time we retell the story, we may come to a new angle of vision. While we might name any number of problematic stories, I focus on a specific list of what I call problem stories that I think fall within the purview and limits of story care. These include confining stories, undertold stories, and untold stories. And I can only give a brief sketch of each of these, but I'll provide more detail in the course that follows. Many of these stories involve loss, since loss often derails the story we are living. And many of us have experienced a variety of losses during this period of COVID, and so we're aware of how loss can interrupt our stories and cause us to reconsider it. But story care is not designed to address severe trauma or serious mental health issues, as I've noted. And when we encounter these, we must refer. We are companioning each other in the normal processes of our life stories, but sometimes we get stuck and we can only see things one way. And reverent and attentive listening by another reveals to us things we hadn't seen before. Confining stories. Many of us live with these confining stories. These are stories that set limits on what we can do or carry impossible expectations and are often voiced by our inner critic, that little voice in your head that tells you you can't do this or that, such as, you'll never succeed at X because fill in the blank. I'm too old to learn how to play the piano or write a book or fill in the blank. Or I can't take time for myself until everyone else's needs are met. This is a story I often hear clergy tell, and I think mothers feel this as well, many other people. Confining stories may be shaped from the outside in by expectations others have of us or limits others place on us, but they often become internalized. For example, women can't be preachers. Being an artist is not a real job. Real men aren't house husbands. In order to understand how these confining stories were formed, we not only need to discern the backstory, but examine the specific narrative environments that formed it. And in the course, we'll talk about questions we can ask to unearth some of these ways these stories are formed. Another kind of problem stories are both undertold and untold stories. In undertold stories, significant elements are left out, or the story is not fully developed. Sometimes these undertold stories are of our competencies that may be undertold. Well, if I can do it, it must not be that hard. Maybe a story we tell ourselves. Maybe we gloss over past successes, or we don't take these into account when facing new challenges. I've faced something like this before, I can do it again. Those stories somehow get undertold. Stories of trauma or loss that contain difficult emotions may also be undertold. And traumatic stories are particularly difficult because they're fragmented in our memories and it's hard to narrate them. Untold stories may be stories of those open secrets, or stories that include an element of shame, or a story where the teller fears might lead to rejection. Now, these can be difficult stories if they're trauma stories, and again, we have to be careful here and be aware of the limits of our ability to care for others and when referral is necessary. But for some LGBTQ persons, stories of sexual identity have been or still are untold. Stories of sexual abuse or physical abuse are often untold, particularly in the church. And Maya Angelou said, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." If we can build the trust with one another to hold these difficult stories, we can be agents of healing. Some stories are untold simply because we don't deem them important at the time. In Barbara Brown Taylor's memoir, Leaving Church, a memoir of faith, she never mentions that she was the first woman pastor of the rural church she left in the middle of a conflict over building a new sanctuary. Now, Brown Taylor was ordained a priest in the Episcopal Church in 1983, 9 years after the church authorized the ordination of women. Now, it's simply possible that as an author, she considered that story unimportant or not central to the narrative of her memoir. But from my own experience as a woman ordained in 1982 in California, I find it hard to imagine being the first woman pastor of a small church in the North Georgia mountains in 1983 made no difference in her experience of conflict in the church. I find this part of her story untold in this memoir, and perhaps in other places undertold. She just never mentions it. Now, the purpose of all these steps of this practice of life story exegesis is not simply to dig into the story, but to move us towards restoring, to gain a new understanding of the complexity of our stories, and to bring all of the rich strands of our life stories together and to honor them. As story companions, we utilize skills in listening to care for others and accompany them in weaving life stories that are more livable and move us towards flourishing. To become a story companion, then, is to accept the invitation to join another in the creative act of authoring a life story. And as Christians, we believe that God also is a co-author of our life stories. And as we listen to others' life stories, we may find ourselves discovering new dimensions of our own. As we seek glimpses of God's story in a life story, including our own, we may come to a new understanding of God's great love story. Imagine, if you will, what it might be like to become a community of story companions, each one of us accompanying each other in crafting a life story which bear witness to the interwoven threads of divine love as we move towards God's promised flourishing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Scheib, for that wonderful and thoughtful lecture. I know, speaking firsthand, thinking about the first time that we were preaching and teaching in an empty sanctuary and how hard that is, but well done, and thank you so much for making it your time to be with us this evening. You've had a lot of changes in your life recently. You were joking earlier this evening that you would not advise two major life changes during a pandemic. You retired from Emory and Candler School of Theology, and you moved to Savannah in what was, I think, a quick whirlwind. And on top of that, I guess maybe whether it was a third life change or not, but just a lot going on. You recently finished an MFA program where you wrote a collection of essays on language, life, and the birds. And so let's start there. Why did you write essays, and why are you writing essays about birds? And what are you hoping to convey in these essays? I know this is nothing about your lecture, but let's start exactly there.
Well, in some ways, I'm trying to figure out what the stories are about. In creative writing, we talk about the situation and the story. And the situation is sort of, I moved to Savannah. The story is how I'm making sense out of that. So one of the things, of course, when we moved to the community we're in, there is a group called New Neighbors, and we didn't worry about knowing anyone because we thought we'd meet lots of new people. Well, of course, those groups are not meeting. Yeah. So I didn't have anybody to talk to, so I'd walk down to the end of the street, and I happen to be a birder, and my husband's a birder, and I'd walk down to the end of the street where there was a nesting colony of egrets, and I'd watch the egrets every morning. They sort of became my companions, and I'd talk to the egrets. I can't say they talked back, but if they did, that might be troublesome. But in any case, there was something just about watching them, and it was during the breeding season, so I watched the babies hatch, and I watched their little stubby wings and as they flapped around, and there was something about, they became my companions and connected me to a larger world, part of the natural world, which is important to me. It's always grounded me. So that was sort of an expansion of my story when I couldn't develop new human companionship and new friendships, to find a sense of belonging in a different way through being attuned to the natural world. And I'm a big fan of Mary Oliver's poetry, so I often had her notion of paying attention as a form of prayer in mind. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about, the way that nature sustains us and the way God's creation is revealed in that. And for me, how the birds are unusual because they're all around us, but they're very, very different. They're alien to us in some ways. It's not like a dog who seems familiar. So there's something particular about the differentness of birds that I find intriguing in reflecting on who we are.
Yeah, wonderful. Mary Oliver has a line, pay attention and then tell about it or talk about it. So how are we paying attention? I was thinking of the line, don't feed the birds, which kind of ruffles the feathers on the companion breadmate. We got one laugh in the back, so we'll go with that. Okay. Well, let's move on. Tonight you spoke a little bit about interruptions in our lives in regard to COVID and the need for what you call restoring. I know that you're also giving another lecture later this week on the resiliency of Job. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you think the church should be modeling or doing during seasons of suffering, and how might this relate to this concept of restoring?
Well, I don't want to give everything away in that story, but we are approaching it from looking at the different narratives in Job. And of course, what people often think of is the three friends who come to comfort Job, and essentially they all offer a different story to explain what's happening to him. None of them are satisfactory, and he rejects that. And he develops a new story where he sort of wants to take God to court, in a sense, put God on trial. And that story is also challenged. But I think what we see is this process of trying to come to terms with this life, and he continues to move towards a new frame of the story. And I think part of resilience is not holding on to an old story that doesn't work anymore. The three friends want to hold on to stories that are not adequate for Job's experience. And Job sort of plays with that, and he's continually open. And God dislocates even that story in the end when he speaks from the whirlwind. And the book of Job we're sort of left open-ended. We don't really know how Job has changed. So I would say to be open to that process of evolving stories and God's movement to dislocate that.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating to think about Job and restoring in that process. We've sometimes talked here about at the beginning, before the friends say a lot of wrong-headed things, that they just sit on the ground with Job and they listen. And I think there is something, or they don't say anything at all. They just sit. And so how are we sitting and going through these different phases? All right, that's another lecture for you. Okay. In your lecture tonight, you talked about the need for pastoral care to be a responsibility for the whole church. I know that you've written and spoken about this in a lot of your work. You also know maybe just about as much as anyone that I've written on theology and dementia and the dangers that often come along when individuals happen to be facing dementia, that often social isolation occurs. And so we've talked a lot about the need for how can congregations hold the memories and the stories of others through these circles of care. One of the hard realities of COVID is that more people are facing isolation and loneliness during this season. What do you think is different or important about the concept of story companionship or congregation-based pastoral care during this season of pandemic?
I think that's a hard question in some ways, but sometimes I think when I'm talking about story care or story companionship, it's just sort of a common sense way of understanding, of paying attention to each other. I actually find sometimes people in churches don't feel comfortable sharing their stories of struggle, maybe because they feel they'll be judged that they aren't faithful enough. But that's why I want to imagine a community that when we share stories with each other, it's not just companioning, it's a way of being church. It's a way of being honest and vulnerable with one another. It says something about how we understand what it means to be a community of faith. And at this time, I think we have to be creative. I have a former neighbor who's single. I just call her every once in a while. She goes to church online, but she's alone most of the time. And I think the forms of companionship can be simple. Just picking up the phone, letting people talk, to ask about their week. That's a very simple story. It's not a problem story, but we figure out who we are by communicating. Some people are more talkative than others, but I think we need that human companionship, whether it's through Zoom or FaceTime or phone call. Write a note. some ways of just saying, I'm holding you, I'm remembering you, your story, who you are is important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't count how many times I've encouraged people to write notes, make phone calls, let other people know that you're walking with them during this season. When talking about getting the story in view, you observe that a storyteller is often waiting to see if we're really listening before sharing a story that is troublesome. And I'll admit this is something that I've thought a lot about in a world of deadlines and meetings. And I try to remember that if I'm frazzled or distracted, others might decide not to share an important or crucial story with me. This is something that hit home for me once when listening to Sam Wells, a British theologian and preacher. And he was talking about the importance of having ministers who have clean and tidy desks. He was basically saying that if someone comes into your office and papers are piled high and scattered, they might think, oh, you don't really have time for what's going on in my life. I try to have a clean desk for this reason, but you also noted that our attitudes in listening are important. I'm curious, do you think that people listen differently today than in times past? Is it harder to listen today in view of technology or social media or tribalism? And has it always been challenging to be a good listener?
Yes. I think it's always been challenging to be a good listener. I mean, I think there's a reason that therapists only have hours of 45 or 50 minutes. Intentional deep listening takes work and effort. And as you know, much of what I developed out of my own pastoral experience. So I would have people come to the door of the church and say, I didn't like that hymn. Well, that might be a prelude to something else that's going on, and I have to kind of catch that. And part of what I'm trying to do is translate this practice of pastoral care to a lay audience, but I think even our friends do that. They check to make sure we're with them, that we're tracking. But I do think it's harder to listen. There's so many stories, and social media doesn't help. We're inundated by what I'd call thin stories. So like stories on Facebook or stories on social media are thin stories. And there's not much to it. We don't know the context. We don't know how to interpret things. And I think we're so bombarded that it's hard to pay attention. And we also end up in little sort of bubbles where we're sharing the same kinds of stories with each other, and we're not really exposing ourselves to a different story. We can't always hear something that's outside of our comfort level. So I think in some ways it's harder to listen now. And that's why it's probably more important, and people are so hungry for just that, being listened to.
Yeah. And people are hungry to be listened to. I think that's very much the case. I think I shared this maybe at a class that we were in together, but there's a story that was impactful very early on to me, a professor who was talking about, he preached a sermon, and this woman came up to him after the sermon and said, the sermon was awful, it was terrible, I don't know why you're saying that, and she just went on, and he said he put his hand on her shoulder and said, what's really going on? And she said, well, I just found out that I have cancer. And I think there are the moments that if we're only listening to thin stories or not deeply, that we miss what's really there. We don't walk in deeper ways.
Well, and that's a good example of not just paying attention to the information. He could have followed up by saying, why don't you like the sermon? What was wrong with it? Yeah. But he had an intuition that story, that the gestalt of that story, the form of that story was a complaint, like Job complains about everything that's going wrong. And it was the complaint that he needed to listen to, and there was something deeper in that. And that's where I think sometimes we get caught in stories. We listen for the detailed information rather than the deeper, again, a situation in the story. The situation is I didn't like the sermon. The story is my life is hard, and that word didn't speak to me because I'm suffering.
Yeah, well, and that goes back even to the previous idea about interruptions that come, that when things don't happen in the flow that we expected. I was talking just before this evening about what we're grieving in COVID is not just what's going on, but our lives that we had imagined for ourselves, the futures that we had imagined.
Exactly.
And so when these interruptions occur, how can we restory and reframe to listen in deeper ways?
And it's particularly difficult now because the story of COVID keeps changing. Yeah. When are we getting a vaccine? When is this going to happen? How is the virus transmitted? Do you need to wear a mask or not wear a mask? And so we're in this continual chaos. So it's hard for us to form a story, because all of these things are changing. And so we're trying to kind of settle into a story of this is how I live in COVID, and it keeps changing. So it makes it very difficult to imagine what the next part of the story is.
Right. Well, I know that even as a church leadership, that's been one of the difficulties in saying, oh, it will be better at this point, or it will be better at this point. That you don't want to keep putting these dates in front of people of saying, this is when we can all hug again, because it keeps changing the way we understand and process in a world where we're all struggling and isolating, and how do we continue to walk with one another. Well, I don't want to keep you here all night. I'm sure that we could, but well, you wouldn't. You would leave at some point. But let's just end with this. So we are very excited. There's still time to sign up on the Peachtree site for the class, the 5-week class that you'll be teaching. I wonder if you could give us just a little bit of a preview about what you'll be doing and talking about over the course of the next 5 weeks. It begins next Wednesday on November 11th at 7 p.m. It's a Zoom online class, but maybe preview just a little bit of what you have in mind for that class.
Well, tonight I gave a very general overview, drawing from a lot of the ideas from the text I've written on narrative. And I hope in the course, one, for it to be more interactive. I don't know how big the course will be, but to actually to practice some of these different steps of story care, to look at our own narrative environments, to look at what are the stories from childhood that shaped us. We might do some writing and reflection, and to move through those steps to begin to think about how we can become story companions. So that's part of what I hope to do. Is it?
That's
more?
perfect. Yeah,
okay.
That'll be great. Well, we look forward to that beginning next Wednesday. Thank you again for coming to Peachtree this evening. And we're going to end this evening. We're happy to have someone from the Candler Foundry with us this evening. So Crystal Golden is here, and this event is in partnership both with Peachtree Christian Church and the Candler Foundry. And so we'll let Crystal have the final word, saying a little bit about that, and give us a final prayer and benediction.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Crystal Golden, and I serve as the program coordinator for the Candler Foundry. The Candler Foundry seeks to bring theological education to all through a variety of programs, such as our courses in the community that connect Candler faculty to local congregations and communities to engage in topics that help us think deeply about our faith and how we live it out. We also host events such as this one, and so I would like to thank the staff of Peachtree Christian Church, to you, Dr. Scheib, for presenting your scholarship and being with us this evening in this format. When we started planning this, we did not imagine that this is where we'd be, but here we are. And as mentioned earlier, the course is still open for registration. And so if you are interested in participating, you can visit the Peachtree Christian Church website and navigate to the registration form. And now I'd like to close us in prayer. Please join me. Good and gracious God, Lord God, we give you thanks for this evening. God, we give you thanks for this gathering. And God, we give you thanks that we can gather with one another to listen to these stories. Lord God, as our country grapples with this season, God, remind us that it is our stories that help us connect deeply with one another. God, help us to hear the stories of those who are most vulnerable in our communities, and for us to take those stories and to engage and act from them. God, we pray that you continue to give us peace in our hearts. God, that you give us rest for the days to come. And God, that you give us action steps to give us things to move forward on. It's in your Son's holy name that we pray. Amen. Thank you, everyone, and good night.